Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today, welcome to my February wrap up. I'm going to be telling you about everything that I read in the month of February. So I read 10 books in February, which I'm pretty pleased with considering the fact that February is quite a short month. There are a few things from my February TBR that I'm still working my way through and carrying on over into March, but today I'm just going to talk about the 10 books that I did finish in February. Before I get into the books I read, I'm going to have a quick goals check-in, as I started to do at the beginning of my wrap-ups. One of my big goals for 2025 is to finish reading all of the novels of Anthony Trollope, and I did indeed read one book by Anthony Trollope in February. Another of my big 2025 goals was to read the 19 books that had been on my TBR for the longest. I read 2 of those books in February. I also have a goal this year to try and read more international literature, and this month I read books from 4 countries: the UK, Ireland, South Korea and Nigeria, and I also read 1 book in translation. So we'll start off with the Anthony Trollope book I read in February, and that was La Vendée from 1850. This was one of Anthony Trollope's first novels. I think it was his 3rd novel out of the 47 that he wrote, and it's quite different from his other books. It's a work of historical fiction. It's set in 1790s France during the counter-revolution and civil war that took place in La Vendée, and it looks at various characters who are on the royalist side following the French Revolution and how they are trying to resist the new republican regime. This kind of begins with resistance amongst the peasantry to military conscription from the new French Republic, and then that ends up kind of turning into a bigger conflict. And we're following various characters, chiefly focusing on the kind of aristocracy in La Vendée and their role in the military operations. So there are 3 friends, 3 aristocratic / gentry gentlemen, and we're kind of following them as well as their sisters and love interests, and several other characters too. There were a lot of things I really liked about La Vendée. I found it very historically interesting, both the look at 1790s France and also someone in Victorian Britain looking back on 1790s France. And in general, it was a really engaging read with some wonderful moments. Anthony Trollope is one of my absolute favourite authors. I always love all of his books, pretty much. I love the way he writes. I love the way he looks at character relationships. And I feel like there were some fantastic scenes and also some really interesting characters. One character who I really didn't like as a person, but was really interestingly drawn. I thought he was great. I don't in general love a novel with lots of military stuff in it, and especially kind of the 19th century style of writing about that kind of thing tends to be a little bit pulled back. So I didn't find the kind of battlefield and battle tactics scenes that engaging necessarily. There were a couple of action sequences that weren't on a battlefield, where there were action sequences kind of taking place in slightly different settings, and I thought they were fantastic and really well done, but the actual battles themselves I wasn't quite as engaged in. But you know, along with all the kind of military and political stuff in the book, there are also lots of love stories, as of course there are. It's an Anthony Trollope book, and I thought the love stories and kind of other plot lines to do with character relationships were done really well. It's interesting that, to my knowledge, Anthony Trollope didn't write any other novels with lots of military action in. I mean, I do still have a few of his books left to read, but I don't think it's something he returned to a lot. This was his 3rd novel, and I don't think he wrote much like this again. Maybe he didn't like it, maybe it didn't do very well. It didn't feel necessarily like Anthony Trollope writing the thing he was best at, but I did still think it was interesting and good overall. I buddy read this with Faith from Faith and Books, and it was really interesting to discuss the book with her. Then I read one modern classic in February, and that was The Joys of Motherhood by Buchi Emecheta. This is a Nigerian novel from 1979. I got it out of the library and I've had to give it back now, but I'll put a cover up on the screen. And this was fantastic. Very grim, but very good. Really powerful and clever and interesting and really sort of gripping, but not a easy, cheerful read. For a book with joy in the title, it's not joyous. This novel basically looks at the life of one woman growing up in Nigeria from the kind of 1920s, 1930s through to the sort of 1950s. I would say the bulk of the action takes place in the 1930s and 40s, but we have a bit either side as well. And we're basically looking at the whole life of this woman. She grows up in a village, but ends up later moving to Lagos. And we look at what life is like for her. She feels from a young age that her main purpose in life is to be a mother. And the way that that belief and the society and people around her imprisons her, basically, is so powerfully drawn. It is a really grim book, but it is really, really good. The way the book looks at colonialism and its effect on everyone, but also specifically its effect on women, I thought was really interestingly explored too. And actually reading this book made me think also about how much I had loved Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangarembga, which I read at the end of last year. So if anyone has any more recommendations of like post-colonial feminist literature, that would be great. I kind of feel like I need to seek out more books in that sort of area looking at those themes. Then in February, I also read Kim Jeong, born 1982 by Cho Nam-ju, translated from the Korean by Jamie Chang. This is a novel from 2016, but it actually was a really good one to read back to back with The Joys of Motherhood, because they wrote about a lot of similar themes. Considering these books were written decades apart in different parts of the world, they touch on a lot of similar things. And I thought they kind of worked really well to read as a pair. I was listening to Kim Jeong, born 1982, on audiobook like over the same few days that I was reading The Joys of Motherhood, and that was a really kind of interesting pairing. So Kim Jeong, born 1982, looks at the life of a woman growing up in South Korea in the 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, looks at her childhood, her young adulthood, her marriage, and her early days of motherhood, looking after a small child. It looks at the experiences of growing up as a girl and woman in a world that values girls and women so much less than it values men and boys. And it was so powerful, and like The Joys of Motherhood, it is quite grim in many ways, but it's also really powerful and really interesting and talks about a lot of very important things. And you know, in many ways this book is very specifically about Korean society, but there is also so much in it that is applicable to so many other societies and so many other cultures, and there are so many aspects of Kim Ji-young's experience that feel very, very familiar, and that definitely happen in the UK. Another thing actually that both The Joys of Motherhood and Kim Ji-young, born 1892, look at really interestingly is kind of generational divide and generational change, and how things change from generation to generation, but some things don't change, and also like how different generations don't necessarily communicate things with each other. I thought that stuff was really interesting in both of them as well. And yeah, I just thought Kim Jeong, born 1982, was fantastic. I mean, obviously it was very successful a few years ago, and many people have already read it and know it is great, but just to add my recommendation into the pile. Another thing I quite liked about Kim Jeong, born 1982, is that it's written in quite like a matter-of-fact way, which kind of makes all the injustices within the book feel like so much worse in a way. I don't know, I just thought it was really good, so definitely would recommend that one. Another novel I read and loved this month was Conclave by Robert Harris. This is one of the books that has been on my TBR for far too long, so I'm glad that I finally read it, especially as I do want to watch the film adaptation, which is meant to be fantastic, and I thought this book was great. I really like Robert Harris, and this book was no exception. I read this book for a reading vlog, so I'll leave that video linked down below where I talk about this in more detail, but Conclave is basically a novel about what happens after the Pope has died. After the death of the Pope, all of the cardinals of the Catholic Church are kind of sealed inside a conclave, inside a particular complex, and they can't leave that complex or have any contact with the world outside until they vote for a new Pope. And we basically follow several days of this voting system and all the kind of political rivalries and intrigues and different viewpoints within all of these different cardinals who are you know, competing to be the next pope, basically. And the book goes in directions that you wouldn't expect, and it is so tense. Like, for a book that is literally about a bunch of elderly men sat around talking about things, it is so tense. And I thought that was fantastically done. I just thought Conclave was really interestingly done, Really great novel, wonderful moments, very tense, everything Robert Harris is good at. Really interesting characterization and look at all these different people and all the different tensions between them. And yeah, overall, really, really enjoyed this one. Then the rest of my wrap up is all historical fiction because I read a lot of historical fiction in February. So the first two books I want to talk to you about are books from the long list for the Walter Scott Prize for historical fiction. I've made a separate review video talking about these two books where I talk about them in a lot more detail. Will that be up before this video? Possibly not. It will be coming very soon. The first of these books is Clear by Karis Davies. I won't talk too much about it because I'll talk more about it in that review video. But Clear is a wonderful, very short novel set in 1840s Scotland, or more specifically on an island off the coast of Scotland. This small island is inhabited by one man, Ivor, whose family lived there for a very long time. He is now the last member of his family, the last member of his community, living on this island, tending to his animals, growing his crops. He hasn't seen another person for years when someone arrives on this island, a man called John Ferguson. And John Ferguson is a clergyman who has been sent by the landowner, the person who owns this island, in order to evict Ivor from this property as part of the clearances, which is something that happened in Scotland in the 18th and 19th century, where members of poorer rural communities were evicted from their land in order to make way for farming and sheep grazing. And this book basically looks at the dynamic between Ivor and John in the month they spend together on this island, and we sometimes also follow John's wife Mary on the mainland. It's such a clever, powerful, short novel that is really engaging to read, with just fantastic character relationships and fantastic characterization. It's also a really interesting book if you're interested in language, because Ivor doesn't speak English or Scots. He speaks another language that isn't really spoken by anyone else. I'll talk a bit more about this stuff in my review video. But John and Ivor therefore have to learn how to communicate with each other. And the way this book looks at language and the difficulty of communication was really, really interesting, as well as looking at a lot of like fascinating social history stuff. And I just thought it was great. It's very short. The audiobook is literally just 3 hours, but there are 3 hours that are really worth spending on this book because it's very, very good, very impactful, very poignant, very beautiful. And I just loved it a lot. So I really recommend Clear by Karis Davies. And then the other book I read from the Walter Scott Prize long list in February was Glorious Exploits by Ferdia Lennon, which I read just before the long list was announced, but I had a suspicion that it might make the Walter Scott Prize long list, and I'm so glad it did because it is fantastic. Glorious Exploits is just... oh, it's so good. I've spoken a lot more about that in my review video because I had so much to say about Glorious Exploits. Basically filmed that review video like just before filming this video to ensure that I don't just like waffle on for an hour about Glorious Exploits because I feel like I could. Glorious Exploits is a wonderful novel set in ancient Sicily in 412 BC. Sicily was recently invaded by Athens, but the Athenians lost. And now the quarries of Syracuse are filled with Athenian prisoners of war who are basically slowly starving to death. We are following two out-of-work Sicilian potters, Lampo and Gellon. Gellon is obsessed with Athenian theatre and especially with Euripides, and he decides that he wants to direct a play using the Athenian prisoners of war as actors. And him and Lampo effectively bribe the Athenian prisoners of war with food in order to get them to act in their play. And it feels like such a wild premise, but like, you've got to read it. It's so good. The way this book looks at power dynamics and how war leads to dehumanization. And this book is so powerful and both like so funny and so tragic and so grim, but so well done. And I thought the characterization was just incredible. The book is also written in a very like Irish style. The slang and the turn of phrase used are very Irish, and it's really worth listening to the audiobook in order to hear the book in an Irish accent, I think. And I feel like Lampo's voice and the voice of the other characters around him and the kind of narrative style served the book so well. And I just thought Glorious Exploits was incredible. Like every time I think about Glorious Exploits, I just think everyone should read it. Like, just absolute top tier historical fiction. So good. It was so good. Like, what more can I say? It was fantastic. Then in February, I also read The Midnight Carousel by Faiza Siab McLynn. This is a proof copy. This novel is coming out towards the end of April, and I really, really love this one. From the cover and like the title, I had in my head that it was going to be like slightly Night Circus-esque, but actually the book it reminded me most of was The Whalebone Theatre by Joanna Quinn, which is a wonderful, wonderful novel. And I think one of the reasons why it reminded me of The Whalebone Theatre is because it's set over quite a long period of time. The prologue takes place in 1900, and then the main body of the book takes place kind of from 1910 through to the 1920s. And we follow two characters, one of whom is a detective in the French police, who at the beginning of the book has finally made an arrest on a case that has been troubling him and his fellow detectives, where several children have gone missing riding a carousel at a travelling fun fair. Finally, an arrest is made, the case is closed, and the carousel is sold abroad, only to be bought by the guardian of Maisie, who is our other main character. Maisie and her guardian set up a fun fair to make use of their new carousel, but then children start to go missing while riding the carousel once again. Circumstances end up bringing the detective Laurent into contact with Maisie, and everything kind of goes on from there. There is so much that I love about this book. It's very gothic in many ways. You know, you never know, is there a practical or a supernatural, ghostly explanation for what is happening? And part of the joy of this book is kind of puzzling that out. I feel like the atmosphere of this book was just so great throughout. I also love the look you get into, you know, several decades of history in France, in the UK, in the US. Maisie and her guardian are from England, but end up in Chicago for most of the novel. And as I had with The Whalebone Theatre, I really enjoyed looking at this kind of longer stretch of time. It's a really, really engaging read, and I thought the kind of mystery at its heart was just so well done. But also there's so much going on around the mystery. So much in terms of the characterization and the character relationship, Maisie's difficult childhood, and how that affects her in adulthood. And so much more. And I just thought it was really cleverly, powerfully done throughout. So I would really recommend The Midnight Carousel. Such a great read. And yeah, I think if you like The Whalebone Theatre, you would like this. They are quite different in some ways. They're definitely different in atmosphere. Like The Whalebone Theatre is not a book I would describe as gothic, but there was something about this book that made me think of The Whalebone Theatre, and I think if you like one, you'll probably like the other. Then another wonderful book I read in February was The Queen of Fives by Alex Hay. This is Alex Hay's new novel that has only just come out. I also have his debut, The Housekeepers, on my TBR, but I haven't read that yet because I went along to an event that Alex Hay was doing, talking about this book, and it just sounded so fantastic that I immediately picked it up like the day after the event, and I thought this was so good. This is such a me book. Like, you know, when you know that a book wasn't written expressly for you, but it also kind of feels like it was. So this book is set in the Victorian period in 1890s London, and we are following a con woman called Queen LeBlanc, who is the Queen of Fives, the queen of her particular sort of company of con artists, and she is preparing to con a duke out of his fortune using a ploy called the false heiress. We follow Quinn on her mission to carry out this con. But meanwhile, we're also following the duke that she is trying to con and his sister, who may have secrets of their own. And it becomes clear quite early on in the novel that while Quinn is carrying out her own ploy, someone is watching her with malicious intent. And it's just, oh, it's so good. It's just like such an utter delight of a book. So engaging, so twisty-turny. The pacing was like immaculate. It was one of those things where I guessed like one or two minor things as we went, and then there was one thing I guessed and felt so clever like 2 pages before it was revealed, which is exactly when you should guess something. And I just thought the twists and turns were so good. I just thought this was such a joy. Like, the Victorian setting, the characterization, the con artist elements were all so fun and so well done. I don't know if any of you used to watch the TV program Hustle, but I used to really love Hustle as a teenager. That was one of my favorite TV shows for a long time. It is about a group of con artists, and it's great fun. And I had forgotten how much I loved Hustle. And reading this book was like combining all my like teenage love of Hustle with all my teenage and continuous love of Victorian history. And it was just so good. and it was just a delight. So yes, I feel like if you have similar bookish taste to me, and if you love a good Victorian adventure, that is just like super thrilling and super engaging with excellent twists and turns. Very Sarah Waters as well, actually. Like, I think if you like Fingersmith, you'll like The Queen of Fives. So yeah, that was an utter delight. I feel like this has been a very positive video so far because I read some fantastic books in February, but I also read two works of historical fiction that I didn't really get on with. So I've saved them to the end so that if you're not a fan of negativity, you don't have to stick around. I have complicated thoughts on these two. Where shall I begin? I read Golden Hill by Frances Bufford, which was the historical fiction book club pick for my Patreon this month. And none of us liked it. Everyone in the book club really struggled with it, which in a way was actually really nice. Like, I genuinely feel like it's one of my favourite book club experiences so far because we all could talk about the fact we didn't like it and didn't really get it together in a way that was quite satisfying and really nice, and definitely made the reading experience easier and more fun. But also, this was very much not for me. So this novel is set in 18th century New York, and we're following a mysterious man called Mr. Smith, who at the beginning of the book arrives in the town of New York. It's not even really a city yet, and he arrives on secret business. We don't know why he's come to New York. We don't find out for some time, but he seems to have a lot of money, and no one knows whether he is a fraud or a scoundrel or here on honest business. And quite a lot of the book kind of looks at secrets and lies and disguises and deception, but we are, as a reader, kind of at a remove from Mr. Smith, and we don't know what his plans are for quite some time. But we follow him in his life in New York, in the various scrapes he gets himself into, and also in his growing relationship with a young woman called Tabitha. There was a lot that I really struggled with in this book. I'm holding up this physical book, but I actually read most of this on audiobook. I read the first like 100 pages maybe. Yeah, probably 100 pages physically. And I was struggling with the writing style so much that I decided to switch over to the audiobook because otherwise I didn't think I would get through it. The writing is very dense, really long sentences, really long paragraphs, and I found it like such a difficult reading experience, like so hard to get through every page. Like, people say all the time that like Dickens is quite hard to read, but like Dickens is so much easier to read than this. The writing style was very much not for me. I did find it easier once I switched over to the audiobook. That definitely made it more engaging, and I got on with it more from that point. But in general, I didn't love the writing, and I found the plotting very random, and it felt like things happened sort of for no reason, or it felt like something happened in order for something else to happen next rather than it leading on from what had gone before. And I also found it very hard to be invested because we were kept at such a remove from the main character. There was also something fairly early on in the book that really bothered me, which is kind of a spoiler, but I'm actually going to tell you because I feel like it's such a weird plot point that it's probably better to know. It'll probably bother you less if you know it. I'll put a note up on the screen if you do want to skip the spoilers. So basically, Smith meets a young woman called Tabitha, and Tabitha pretends to be disabled. She pretends she has difficulty walking, and then like a chapter later, it turns out she was just pretending and she doesn't actually have any problems walking. She's not disabled. She was just making that up because she likes to lie. And I thought it was both like really off and uncomfortable, but also it was a really random plot point that didn't make any sense. Like, it almost felt like something you would find in a Victorian novel that had been written serially. Like, the author wrote a disabled character and then was suddenly like, oh, actually, I don't want her to be disabled anymore, so I better retcon it. Like, that was what it felt like. It was so strange. And I had sort of problems with Tabitha and her presentation throughout. I felt she was a bit sort of manic pixie dream girl-esque, and she didn't really feel that coherent to me. But that bit especially sort of really bothered me, and meant that therefore I didn't like Tabitha, and the way that Smith reacts to it as well was really like unpleasant. So that kind of stopped me liking either Tabitha or Smith. I don't know, there were moments in this book that were great, and there were some really powerful scenes, and there were some really interesting themes explored, but every time I would feel like, oh, I'm kind of liking this, then the plot would do something else wild that I didn't understand, and yes, this was so not for me, like really not for me. So yes, there we go. I feel like I haven't been this negative about a book for ages, but you know, this book did very well. Frances Bufford doesn't need me to like his books, it's fine. And yeah, this was not for me. Another book that was not for me, Islands of Mercy by Rose Tremaine. This was the other book from my long-term TBR that I picked up this month, and I didn't really like it. I have read 2 of Rose Tremaine's books before, and I think probably she's just not an author for me. I didn't really get on with the Gustav Sonata, but I did like Absolutely and Forever, but that was very, very short. And I think that helped my enjoyment of it, because actually for the first like half of Islands of Mercy, I was quite enjoying it. And then the directions the story took in the second half just really, really didn't work for me. So Islands of Mercy is set in the 19th century, partly in Bath, partly in London, and also partly in Borneo. And we are following various characters. So we kind of begin with a woman opening a tea room in Bath, and then we follow 2 people who come into her tea room, and then we follow one of their brothers who is in Borneo, and then we follow a man who his brother meets in Borneo, and you know, we kind of branch off into various different directions from there. And the kind of central plot, if this book has a central plot, is following Jane, who turns down a proposal from a man at the beginning of the book. Then not long after that meets a woman who she is deeply, deeply attracted to, and she can't decide whether she wants to kind of pursue a more conventional life or a life that she knows will not be approved of by the society she lives in. And everything kind of goes on from there. This book, I think, was just too literary for me. Like, I know I say that quite a bit and people don't always know what I mean, but I mean it was unfocused and sprawling in a way that I don't love, and I could never get a grasp on what I was meant to think. I kind of liked the first half of this book, but in the second half the plot went in directions that didn't really work for me. The ending itself was very ambiguous. There were some like characters who I thought I was being directed to not like that then I think I was meant to like, and vice versa. And I never quite knew what I was meant to focus on. Like the second half of the book just didn't quite bring everything together for me. And I think partly that is to do with this being a work of literary fiction, and I am not always a massive fan of literary fiction. There's some literary fiction I absolutely love. You know, both Clear and Glorious Exploits were relatively literary works of historical fiction, but Islands of Mercy, you know, like Golden Hill, just didn't. I also feel like this book was set in the Victorian period but didn't engage with the Victorian period in the ways that I wanted it to. I feel like some works of historical fiction are about a story that happens to take place at a particular point in time, and some works of historical fiction are about a particular point in time. Does that make sense? And I feel like Islands of Mercy was a story that happened to take place in the Victorian period rather than this being a book about the Victorian period. And because I am obsessed with the Victorian period, I like my works of historical fiction set in the Victorian period to be about the Victorian period. In many ways, Islands of Mercy reminded me of The Fraud by Zadie Smith, which I read last year and loved. In that both of these books are quite sprawling, looking at a lot of different characters within the Victorian period, and they both look at quite a lot of similar themes to do with the position of women, to do with like what isn't and isn't acceptable within society, and to do with like the British Empire in the 19th century. But I feel like The Fraud delved a lot deeper into all of those things. And I also feel like The Fraud looked at class in a way that just wasn't really present in Islands of Mercy. Like, this book didn't really engage with the Victorian class system in the way that I wanted it to, and in a way that I felt like the story merited. And I also found like the exploration of British imperialism and the empire wasn't like as deep as I would have liked it to be. And the presentation of the only like non-Western character in the book I thought was a bit off. Overall, this just wasn't one for me. I know Rose Tremaine is a hugely successful writer of historical fiction who a lot of people love, but I just don't think her books are for me. And actually, I feel like I had a very similar experience with the Gustav Sonata. It was quite a long time ago that I read it, but I feel like there too, I liked the first half and then felt like the second half just didn't pull it together in the way that I wanted. I like a sort of clearer focus and plot in my novels, I think. And you know, so much of this comes down to personal taste. Even like, I really didn't like the very end of this book because it felt very ambiguous, and we were focusing in the final chapter on a character who we barely knew and had barely seen throughout the book. And actually, if I think about it objectively, that makes a lot of sense because, like I said, this book is kind of full of characters branching off other characters, and it's almost like the end of the book, we're just branching into a new character's life, and that really made sense with what the book is, but I really didn't like it. So yeah. Anyway, February was a mixed month. Generally very, very successful, read a lot of great books, and 2 books that were really not for me, and that is fine. I feel like I read 5-star books and 2-star books and nothing in between. Well, the Vondi was probably a 4-star, but anyway, that doesn't really matter, does it? In general, I read a lot of truly, truly fantastic books this month. Like, I feel like quite a lot of the books I read in February will end up in my favourite books at the end of the year. But I did also read 2 books that I really didn't get on with. But, you know, that is fine. Not all books are for everyone. Please do let me know down in the comments if you've read these books, what you thought of them. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.